Damn it, I keep forgetting my shades. What the fuck? Hello, Jacksonites, and welcome to another horror movie review. No beating around the bush. Today is a bit of a special one. Today, I will be reviewing the 1985 vampire movie, Fright Night. That really rolls off the tongue very well. Fright Night. So simple. So, Fright Night, if you remember, is also on my top 20 list of favorite horror movies at number 20. There's a reason for that, but Fright Night is a fun ass movie. Just gonna cut right to the chase with Fright Night. Now, admittedly, I don't have a whole lot of nostalgia for this movie. In fact, I've only seen it twice. But I like to. If a movie is really good and it like leaves a lasting impression on you, I don't really think it should matter if you've seen it only a few times and you don't have much nostalgia for it. Fright Night certainly did leave a lasting impact on me. Now it's probably my second favorite vampire movie ever made. Of course, my number one favorite being 30 Days of Night. But Fright Night is one fun ass flick and one that I didn't expect to review, but here I am. You could kind of say that I was partially inspired by Lord Hellhound from Horror and Metal channel because I think he reviewed this movie about a month ago or so, and that just planted the seed in my head of, hey, I should review Fright Night. So my history with Fright Night is pretty simple and basic. I was first introduced to Fright Night through James Rolfe for, I think it was the 17th or 18th episode of Cinemassacre's Monster Madness Camp Cult season. Oh, you saw it in theaters. Nice. I saw James Rolfe's review of this, and it got me intrigued. It looked like a bit of a one-of-a-kind, unique type film. And it looked like one of those homage movies, as I like to call them, that looked like it was really well done. And so that got me a little curious. And then a few years later, I saw the Boots to Reboots episode of Fright Night, him comparing the original to the 2011 remake. And that one got me a little bit more interested. And especially at the time when a little while after that, I was rewatching that episode and Meta was right next to me. And when she learned that this movie was directed by Tom Holland of Child's Play fame, she got curious. So, Christmas of 2019, I went on a big spending spree on Amazon, and one movie that I just so happened to come across was the original Fright Night for only $6. So I was like, gimme. So I was kind of excited to check this movie out. It looked really good. It looked really fun and entertaining. So me and Meadows sat down when I first got it in the mail in 2019, and we watched Fright Night together, and I was impressed. I was very pleasantly surprised. I really, really liked what I saw. And then I've only watched it one more time after that. It was literally 2 nights ago because I've been hanging out with Lord Hellhound outside of our videos, I'll admit. Well, nothing to hide, but and I think he stated one of his favorite horror movies of all time too is Fright Night, so that's something he and I have in common. And I also once again rewatched the Boots to Reboots episode of Fright Night. I agree with what Boots to Reboots has to say about the remake even more now that I've seen it a second time. And I've also, now that I've seen it a second time, Fright Night that is, it's cemented itself even further as one of my favorite horror movies. Though the reason I put it so low is just because I've only seen it twice, and I have so little nostalgia for it. But yeah, this movie's a classic. And definitely one of my favorite vampire movies. Now, as I've stated, I do find werewolves scarier. And while I will say this movie isn't scary, but it is a great example of a movie that does vampires justice and tries to make them at least threatening. Yeah, this is a classic. Fright Night was written and directed by Tom Holland, this being actually his directorial debut. Not Tom Holland Spider-Man, Tom Holland Fright Night and Child's Play, who would later go on, of course, to direct the original Child's Play movie and also co-write the original Child's Play 3 years later. It stars Chris Sarandon, William Ragsdale, Roddy McDowall of Planet of the Apes fame, and Amanda Bierce, among a couple others. It was released August 12th, 1985, and grossed $24.9 million against a $7 to $9 million budget, which is a little kind of disappointing. Like, this movie is such an 80s creature feature. Like, how the hell did it only make just barely $25 million? But whatever. But since its release, it has received very positive reviews from critics and has, of course, become a big cult classic. Fright Night was followed by a sequel, Fright Night Part 2, in 1988. Oh, directed by Tommy Lee Wallace. It was remade in 2011, directed by Craig Gillespie. I think that's how you pronounce it. Which that movie was, of course, followed by another sequel, Fright Night 2, New Blood, which, according to Lord Hellhound, is a remake of a remake. And thankfully, in October of 2020, Tom Holland himself has confirmed that he is writing a direct sequel to the original film titled Fright Night Resurrection that would bring back characters from the original movie and would ignore the 88 sequel and, of course, the remake. Why? Why ignore the 88 sequel? Whatever, though. If it means another Fright Night movie, bring it. Now, I have not seen Fright Night Part 2, partially because it's very hard to find, unfortunately. I have not seen the remake, and I have not seen its sequel, though now I'm kind of curious. Sue me. I've only seen this first film, but yeah, I like what I see. This movie is a great 80s classic. So with all that being said, let us get into the plot of Fright Night, which is kind of simple, but it's well done. 17-year-old Charlie Brewster, played by William Ragsdale, is a fan of a horror television program called Fright Night, hosted by former movie vampire hunter Peter Vincent, played by Roddy McDowall. One evening, Charlie discovers that his next-door neighbor, Jerry Dandridge, played by Chris Sarandon, is actually a vampire responsible for the disappearances of several victims. After telling his mother, Charlie asks his girlfriend, Amy Peterson, played by Amanda Bierce, who's kind of a whiny bitch in this movie, and his friend Evil Ed Thompson, played by Stephen Jeffries, for help before contacting the authorities. Detective Lennox goes with Charlie to Jerry's house to question him, but his roommate, Billy Cole, tells them that Jerry is away on business, quote unquote. Charlie reveals his suspicions about Jerry's vampirism, and Lennox leaves furious. That night, Charlie is shocked to see Jerry inside his house, having been invited in by Charlie's mother. Later, Jerry visits Charlie and offers him a choice: ignore his vampiric activities or else. Charlie refuses, brandishing a crucifix at Jerry. When Jerry tries to push him out the window to his death, Charlie stabs Jerry's hand with a pencil, which wards him off. Jerry destroys Charlie's car in retaliation and threatens Charlie over the telephone. Charlie turns to Peter Vincent for help, but Peter dismisses Charlie as an obsessed fan. Amy, fearing for Charlie's sanity and safety, hires the destitute Peter to prove that Jerry is not a vampire by having him drink what they claim is holy water, but it is only tap water. Jerry has claimed to Peter that drinking actual holy water would be against his religious convictions, quote unquote. Peter discovers that Charlie is right about Jerry's true nature after glancing at his pocket mirror and noticing Jerry's lack of a reflection, causing him to accidentally drop the mirror. Peter then flees like a pussy, but Jerry learns of his discovery after finding a shard of mirrored glass on the floor. Jerry hunts down Ed and turns him into a vampire, actually a werewolf, but whatever. Then Ed proceeds to visit Peter and tries to attack him, only to be warded off when burned by a crucifix to the forehead. Meanwhile, Jerry chases Charlie and Amy into a nightclub. While Charlie tries to call the police, Jerry hypnotizes and abducts Amy, who resembles Jerry's lost love, and bites her. More on that later. With nowhere left to run, Charlie attempts to gain Peter's help once more. A pussified Peter initially refuses, but then reluctantly resumes his vampire killer role. Entering Jerry's house, the two are able to repel Jerry using a crucifix, though only Charlie's works since he has faith in its spiritual power. Billy appears and knocks Charlie over the banister, and while Peter flees to Charlie's house, there he is surprised by Ed, who attacks him in the form of a wolf, only to be pierced through the heart with a broken table leg held by Peter. Removing the stake from Ed's body, Peter goes to rescue Charlie and battle Jerry. Charlie is locked in with Amy, who is slowly transforming into a vampire. Peter frees him before she awakens and says the process can be reversed if they destroy Jerry before dawn. Billy confronts Charlie and Peter and is revealed to be an undead ghoul. They destroy Billy, who melts into goo and sand, and then Peter is able to lure the overconfident Jerry in front of a window using a crucifix, which now works due to his renewed faith in its abilities. As the sun rises, Jerry transforms into a bat and attacks Peter and Charlie before fleeing into his coffin in the basement. Charlie and Peter pursue Jerry, and the latter breaks open Jerry's coffin and tries to stake him through the heart, while Charlie fights off Amy, who has almost completed transforming into a vampire. By breaking the blacked out windows in the basement, Peter and Charlie expose Jerry to the sunlight, destroying him and returning Amy to her human form. A few nights later, Peter returns to his Fright Night TV series and announces a hiatus from vampires, presenting a film about alien invaders instead. Charlie and Amy watch the program as they embrace in bed, and Charlie gets up to turn off the TV and glimpses red eyes in Jerry's now vacant house, but dismisses them. But unbeknownst to both Charlie and Amy, a new neighbor has just moved in, leading into oh, that's what she was. Leading into the sequel that is very hard to find. Okay. So how about this plot? Well, I can't really say much about it because the plot itself is a pro. But I just will say it's a well done modern vampire story that sticks true to its classic roots, and like it more so feels like an 80s Hammer film than a Universal film. Because I'll talk about Peter Vincent in a little bit, but he's obviously very similar to Peter Cushing from the Hammer series, and just the overall aesthetic. It's very gothic and atmospheric. and it feels like a classic vampire movie, but also done in the 80s, and modernizing the genre, but still making it feel fresh, but also familiar at the same time. So that's all I'm really going to say about it, and also, of course, incorporating 80s practical effects. Um, so that's actually all that I'll say about the plot. Let's just jump right into the pros. I have 10 pros. And I have two cons and two nitpicks. Pro number one is Charlie. I like Charlie. He's a fun character. He's the type of he's the type of horror movie fan that I like. Whenever there's a movie that is this movie isn't quite meta, but it is very goddamn my nose itches. It's very genre friendly. Like this movie is a vampire movie, and it knows that its creators are fans of vampire movies, so its characters are fans of vampire movies. So, um, I totally lost track of what I was going to say. Yeah, it's not quite meta. Like it's not like Scream, but it knows that it's a vampire movie and it's very heavily steeped in vampire roots from, like I said, the Hammer movies. Um, and Charlie is the type of character in movies like this that I like. He knows his stuff. Um, he doesn't have to do any kind of research. You already get the sense that Charlie knows everything about vampires just right off the bat because they firmly establish, and not even doing a whole lot, just showing that he's a big fan of watching Fright Night, the show, that this guy is a big vampire fan and he knows his vampire shit. And it's quite refreshing to see a character and just immediately know what to do and how to handle a situation. Um, I'll admit though, there's a couple times where Charlie just gets a little annoying. Like he's just constantly saying, he's going around saying, "This guy's a vampire. This guy's a vampire. This guy's a vampire." He goes to everybody just screaming, "Vampire, vampire, vampire." But the one thing that's a little annoying is that he doesn't get evidence. No, Friday Night never scared me. Friday Night has never remotely scared me. And in general, this is not a very scary movie. It's a fun movie. So no, Steven, you're wrong. This movie did not scare me. An American Werewolf in London did. You missed that yesterday. Or the day before, but whatever. Um, yeah, so Jerry going around just screaming vampire, vampire, but not having any evidence to really back up his claims is just a little annoying and a little irritating. Um, but you kind of get over it, and especially once the rest of the characters start realizing, oh, yep, he's right. Um, he's a strong character in that sense too, in that he immediately knows. Um, well, rewind this review, Stephen, because I'm not going to explain it now. Um, yeah, once shit starts hitting the fan, he's very competent in picking up weapons and actually trying to fight back against Jerry. He immediately picks up a cross or a stake, or he just starts trying to fight back again. And the first opportunity he gets to kill Billy, the ghoul, he immediately goes for it, stabbing him in the heart. That's a great kill, by the way. Yeah, I like Charlie. He gets a little annoying sometimes, but he's a strong male protagonist, which is kind of rare in 80s horror movies. Yeah, I just now realized this is one of few where there's a male protagonist. Pro number two is Peter Vincent. This is part of the whole another pro that I have for this movie. Actually, I'll talk about this. Pro number two is I listed as great homage and aesthetic. You can very much tell that Tom Holland is a big fan of the 50s, 60s, and 70s Hammer horror films, specifically the Hammer Dracula movies. Horror of Dracula, Dracula Prince of Darkness, Taste the Blood of Dracula, which overall, this movie's plot does feel pretty similar to Dracula Has Risen from the Grave. Yeah, that one. And that one's just the most straightforward. It's kind of an inverse, though. That one is the most straightforward, just regular people fighting against Dracula. And this movie is pretty similar to that as well. And yeah, you can tell that they were big fans of these movies. It looks like a Hammer horror film. It's got lots of fog and dark, shadowy exterior shots, lots of wind blowing through trees to make it look creepy and ominous. Jerry himself may as well just almost be like a super vampire from the Hammer series. And Peter Vincent himself, his name already is a portmanteau of Peter Cushing and Vincent Price. And Roddy McDowall himself looks very similar to Peter Cushing. I think they dyed his hair gray because I don't think Roddy McDowall was actually that old when he did this film. Let's actually see. He died in 1990. Okay, so yeah, he wasn't that old when he did. Well, he was only 70. Damn. Let's see. What the hell? Oh, he was gay. Damn. That is surprising, but also not very surprising. Oh, he died of pancreatic cancer. Huh. This kind of sucks. But yeah, he was I guess he was gay, which again doesn't surprise me. He does look kind of floofy. Anyway, so he would have been, he was 57 when he did this movie. But yeah, I'm pretty sure they like did makeup all over his face to, well, not all over his face, to make him look a bit more wrinkly and a little older. But mainly they dyed the shit out of his hair to make it look gray and very salt and peppery. I actually think they powdered his hair because it looks so gray and it barely moves. But it's very obvious that they're trying to emulate Peter Cushing as Van Helsing from the original Hammer Dracula films. And of course, his last name, Vincent, is an homage to Vincent Price, who is a well-known horror actor, of course. Who doesn't know who Vincent Price is? Come on. And just overall, this movie is very obvious that, like I say in my top 20 video, it's wearing its influences on its sleeves, but it doesn't come off like it's trying to rip anything off from the Hammer series. It's just very obvious that this movie is trying to be a big, loving homage to its roots, and it pays great respects to its roots. I'll get to that in a little bit. But at the same time, still, it's trying to be its own thing. It's not just trying to be a modern day Hammer film. It's taking inspiration and influence from that era and then taking that and morphing it into its own thing. Of course, with the inclusion of the 80s synth music, the teenage characters, and the 80s practical special effects, which are all awesome. More on that in a little bit. Yeah, if you're a big fan of classic vampire movies and Hammer horror films, you'll get a great kick out of this movie. But moving on, pro number 3 is Peter Vincent. At first, he's a little unlikable because he starts out as kind of like a snobby high maintenance actor, or yeah, like an actor um, who does but also doesn't appreciate fans, and then he has to stoop to a low of when taking teenagers' money and then just kind of bullshitting them and providing them with fake shit just to, earn a quick buck for himself. And then when he realizes that monsters are real, um, he then just flees like an asshole and leaves them to their own devices. Like, nope, I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do. Bye. Really? But thankfully, when he does yank his head out of his ass to try to actually help people, and especially like help Charlie and Amy to get out of their situation, he tries very hard, and he tries hard to be brave, and he tries to fight back. Um, and he does his best with what he has, to the best of his ability. So overall, Peter Vincent is a great character. He's a lot of fun to watch, and just Roddy McDowall overall. He brings a certain energy to all of his roles. Like, he's very enthusiastic, and he does his best to make his characters as convincing as possible. I actually think Roddy McDowall is a bit of an underrated actor. So yeah, he's great. He's a lot of fun. Pro number 4 is Jerry, the main villain of the movie. Jerry is a great vampire character. Now, he's not especially, like, he's not that special. Um, but it's the performance. Like, Chris Sarandon is obviously having a lot of fun playing this character. He doesn't choose scenery, but you can just tell he's eating everything up and he's enjoying being a bad guy. And he certainly is intimidating and threatening. He's got like this, he's not super imposing, but you know that when he means business, he really means business. He's got like an air of quiet menace to him when he's dead serious. But like any good vampire, he's also very charming, a great people person, and he knows how to put on a facade and bullshit people into their houses, literally. Um, and he is a bit of a smug douchebag, and it's kind of fun to watch him just fuck with Charlie or Peter, especially like you have to have faith in order for that to work. And he just has like this smug, shit-eating grin on his face. Um, what was that one that? Oh, I know you're there, Charlie. I could see you. He's just totally. Oh, and that scene when he's talking to Charlie's mom, because the classic vampire myth of vampires can only enter a house if you're invited. Um, he gets through that, and he's just constantly rubbing it into Charlie's face that, hey, I'm going to be around here a lot because I've charmed my way into your mom's heart, literally and figuratively. And he's totally just fucking with Charlie that entire time. It's going completely over Charlie's mom's head, because all that she's focused on is this hot piece of man ass in front of him, or in front of her. But the entire time, Jerry is just fucking with Charlie. Um, and then when his monster form comes out, he is intimidating and he is threatening, and he does make for a great monster villain. So that's all well and good. And like I said, Chris Sarandon clearly is having the time of his life with this character. And it's always fun when a villain has a charismatic actor in its role. So that's great. Da, 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 da. Pro number 5. The music score by motherfucking Brad Fidel. Now, before you say anything, not well, there's a couple times where um Huh. There's also comics and a novelization of this movie, though sadly the novelization is way out of print. Anyway, sorry, I'm kind of all over the place here. The music by Brad Fiedel. There's a couple times where it sounds vaguely reminiscent of Terminator, and it is still very synth heavy. Like it sounds a lot like he was using the same instruments for the Terminator. So there's a lot of sounds that do sound similar to his Terminator soundtrack, the first Terminator, not the second one. Um, but this movie soundtrack is still very much its own thing. It just does sound familiar. This movie soundtrack is fucking awesome. It's very 80s. It's very synth heavy. It's very action packed and bombastic, and it really lends itself to a lot of the action scenes and the more like 80s whack out moments that this movie has. There are a few times where the music is fairly suspenseful, um, and it's also a couple times romantic as well, though it leads to one scene that is kind of questionable nowadays that I'll get to in a little bit. But not much to say. Oh, and this movie's theme song that plays during the end credits, the Fright Night theme song, is awesome. I love this movie's theme song. It's so catchy, it's so fun, and it's so descriptive of the movie. It just makes you want to watch the movie all over again. It's a shame that they actually never made a Fright Night TV series because that would have made perfectly for that show's theme song during the opening credits. Like I can totally see an opening intro, like it's like 2 minutes, using that movie soundtrack. It's so fucking cool. Yeah, Brad Fiedel was at the top of his game when he did this movie soundtrack. It's so fun, it's so catchy, it's so 80s, and it's so awesome. Pro number 6 is the film's pacing. It's overall, vampires tend to be kind of like with werewolves. Werewolf movies, they tend to be a bit more slowly paced. And I wouldn't say this movie is slowly paced per se, but it takes its time when it needs to in order to build suspense. Because again, kind of like with werewolves, it's kind of funny how werewolf movies and vampire movies are they hit a lot of the same beats in their stories a lot of the times, but they tend to have similar tropes. Like there's the death scenes, or not the death scenes, but like there's the mysterious kills and the slow suspicion, the gathering of evidence, and then convincing others that there's a vampire, and then there's the confrontation, just like in Dracula. Well, I mean, Dracula invented a lot of those tropes, but still. Surprisingly, this movie doesn't really take a lot of influence from the Universal Dracula movies. Probably for the better because a lot of them suck. um, but yeah, this movie's pace, it's not slow, but it does know when to take its time and build character and builds a little bit of suspense. And overall, the film flows at a pretty natural pace. It takes its time when it needs to, and it's fast and fun for a majority of the movie when it needs to be. Yeah, you'll certainly never be bored while watching this film. Pro number 7 is the wait, no, is it 7? 1, 2, 3. Yeah, 7 is the fun 80s tone. This movie is 80s as fuck. It's dripping in 80s it's dripping in 80s fashion, it's dripping of 80s music, it's dripping of 80s colors, it's dripping of 80s TV stuff, like a whole bunch of homage stuff. Another thing that's very homage heavy with this movie is, and like lovingly homaging, is Peter Vincent is a horror movie host that's very similar to like Vampira or Elvira. And especially if you're a fan of like the Monster Vision, you'll get a kick out of all the Fright Night scenes with this movie. But I think that from what I've seen, it looks like that's done even better in Fright Night 2. Just a shame I can't see it. But yeah, the fun 80s tone of this movie is very, very good. It doesn't, well, I mean, it does date itself pretty heavily in the 80s, but, and you know, Terminator does this too, but I think that one even more so dates itself to the point where it's almost a slight issue. But here it is dated, but it's dated in a fun way. It makes you nostalgic for the 80s, and it makes you nostalgic for when you were a kid or like a teenager, especially a horny teenager, watching horror movies and reading comics and hanging out with your friends and going to high school in the 80s. It makes you nostalgic for a fun time in your life. At least it does for me. Even then, like again, this movie always makes you think of Camp Colt of Monster Madness, and that was a very nostalgic and interesting year for myself back in 2010. But yeah, the 80s tone of this movie is a lot of fun, and it's well pulled off, in my opinion. Again, this movie is a fun movie. It's not scary. It's not trying to change your life. It's just trying to be a fun 80s vampire creature feature. Speaking of which, the vampire lore that's executed in this movie is great. This is a bit of a strange pro, but if you're a fan of vampires, this movie sticks to its vampire roots very much so. It stays true to all the classic vampire myths. They don't like crosses. You have to stake them through the heart with a stake and a hammer, which was right out of the Hammer Dracula movies or the Hammer vampire movies. Yeah, they don't like crosses. They don't like holy water. They're killed by sunlight. You have to have faith in order for a cross to work, which that's another thing that's very similar to Dracula Has Risen from the Grave. And it's also, this movie is a good inverse of that film. In Dracula Has Risen from the Grave, the main character is a guy named Paul, who is an atheist. And there's a scene where, God damn, my nose itches. There's a scene when Paul is going to stake Dracula. He stakes him through the heart, but it doesn't kill Dracula because he doesn't have faith. So Dracula is able to get up and rip it out of his heart and throw it. Dracula's actual death in that movie is more religiously symbolic by him being impaled on a cross. So not only is he impaled on a religious artifact, but when he goes to touch it, it's like a Bible. It burns his skin. So he just dies impaled on the cross. And at that point is when Paul finds his faith. This movie is a bit of a good inverse of that. Charlie, being the one in Paul's shoes, does have faith and does believe in vampires. And Peter Vincent, because Paul's girlfriend's dad in Dracula Has Risen from the Grave, is a priest. And Peter Vincent may as well be Paul, and Charlie may as well be the priest character. Charlie and the priest have faith. Peter Vincent and Paul do not have faith. And at the end of the movie, they regain their faith and they're able to fight back against the vampire. But yeah, the vampire lore in this. Oh, and they don't cast reflections, of course. If you're a big fan of classic vampire movies, this movie is just right up your alley. It feels very much at home. Oh, and of course, vampires can't enter a house unless they're invited. So if you're a big fan of classic vampire lore and movies, this movie's right up your alley. It feels perfectly at home in that subgenre of horror movies. Like, it definitely is a vampire movie. Pro number 9 is the fun creature and monster action. Watching Peter and Charlie run around fighting off Billy, who's a ghoul, and of course fighting off the various forms of Ed and Jerry is a lot of fun. They put up a good fight, but also Jerry and Ed put up really good fights. Not much to say other than, oh, and of course, Jerry dealing with Amy running around there too as a half vampire. That's all good creature feature monster stuff. That's a lot of fun too. But this leads into the final pro of this film. Pro number 10 is the fantastic practical effects. My God, there's not as much effects. Like, it's kind of like what James Rolfe says. It's saved for like the last 15 to 20 minutes, but it makes a very entertaining 15 to 20 minutes. Um, the practical effects are phenomenal. When Billy is killed, he literally melts into green goo and sand. The sand doesn't make, well, I could say that's his bones, but still, that one's weird. But when Billy is melting away and dying, it's gross, it's goopy, it's oozy, it's slimy, and it's gnarly. It's a great spectacle of practical effects. I'm pretty sure what they did to showcase that is that they just had like a dummy made out of wax, and they just aimed hot studio lights at Billy to make it melt. But it's still a great death, and it's very well done and a lot of fun to watch. And Jerry's various vampire forms, like when he elongates his fingers, or when his fangs come out, when his eyes glow red, and when he morphs into a more monstrous vampire form, that's all really good stuff. It's great practical effects and great makeup. There's a couple flubs, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Um, Also, when Jerry turns into a vampire, the puppets and animatronic effects for Jerry are really good there too. When Ed, well, there's one issue I have. Well, Ed is an issue in and of himself, but when Ed is morphing back into his human form from his werewolf, it's a really, really great effect. It does come off as being a little reminiscent of an American Werewolf in London. But I mean, that was a big template movie for horror comedies and modern day werewolf and vampire movies. So you can just say they're just following that example. But it looks great. It kind of looks like Ed kind of. Well, actually, no, it's a bit more reminiscent of The Howling, because he's not transforming like a werewolf. He's like a shapeshifter, like what the werewolves are in The Howling. So that overall, the effect on Ed when he's transforming back into a human is really gnarly and looks painful. Not even remotely relevant to this stream, Shawnee boy. What the hell? Um, the best effect, in my opinion, is Jerry's death. Jerry's surrounded by sunlight, and he's about to kill Peter, but then Charlie shows up and yanks down a curtain, and an entire window of sunlight just blasts Jerry into the wall, and he melts and burns away into like this. It's a little obvious that it's like a puppet on strings, but it still looks great. Of Jerry turning into like this bat human screeching banshee hybrid. It's a great spectacle. And then when he finally kind of explodes and then just disintegrates into nothing, it's a great effect and a great vampire kill. Yeah, the special effects in this movie are pretty fucking awesome. Well, I wouldn't say they're underused, but they knew when to use them, and they knew when to use them to great effect, and they're effective. So that's all really good. Now onto my two cons and two nitpicks. I'll actually start with my nitpicks. There are a couple of flubs in the special effects. The one that stuck out to me the last time I watched it was the scene when Jerry is fucking with Charlie and Charlie's mom. He's in Charlie's mom's room, and he just like kind of menaces her and watches over her. Then he turns around and he's in front of a mirror, and it's obvious it was a blue screen, because when Jerry walked in front of it, you could see the blue kind of bleeding into Jerry's clothes. And the blue screen effect kind of shifts around a little bit in the background. I didn't notice it the first time I watched this movie, but it jumped out to me last time I saw this film. It's not bad, and they don't linger on it too much, and it is effective in showing that Jerry is indeed a vampire because he has no reflection. But it's just slightly distracting. And the only other flub in the effects that really stuck out to me, whenever Jerry had elongated fingers, you can tell that he just had finger extensions on his hands, because you can see when the piece was added onto his finger, and they just like maybe glued or like put paste on the extensions and pasted them onto his fingers to make them extended. It's kind of inconsistent. Like sometimes they're convincing, like when Jerry is feeding on his second victim and he spots Charlie spying on him through the window, and he goes up to pull down the shades, and you can tell his fingers are a lot longer. That one looks good, but the worst one, in my opinion, is when Jerry goes to turn Ed into a vampire. He says, "Take my hand," to be a vampire, and because it's so well lit, you can obviously tell on his fingers where the extension begins and his finger ends. It's a little distracting, and again, they don't, well, no, that one they do kind of linger on it twice. There it just kind of sticks out, no pun intended, like a sore thumb. They're not huge effects, and they're not huge flubs. They're just slightly distracting. Nitpick number 2 is, well, the part of the story that Amy resembles a long lost lover of Jerry from a long time ago is kind of interesting. They don't do that much with it, but vampire falls in love with a female woman, typical stuff. It also is just a little corny and a little cliche, I'll say, for lack of a better term. But what kind of sticks out to me, Jerry, she's a minor, right? I know vampires really shouldn't care about human laws because they're vampires, but it just is a little creepy when Jerry is trying to fuck a 17-year-old. Again, I know it was the 80s, and the actress playing Amy more than likely was not actually 17. Actually, she couldn't have been because we don't see them, but she shows her tits to Jerry, and it's just a little awkward and cringy during that scene. But what's even more awkward is knowing that Jerry is hundreds of years old, and he's trying to literally neck on a 17-year-old. It's just a little awkward, in my opinion. But speaking of Amy, my first con with this film, like big con, is Amy herself. She's kind of annoying. She spends a lot of this movie kind of being a whiny and bitchy panty waist. Like her care and love for Charlie is very evident. Like she does actually have feelings for Charlie, and she actually does want to help him and is worried about him. But a lot of the first act, she just spends it almost entirely being kind of a whiny bitch, and just gets a little annoying. And she herself is kind of just a cliche. She's either the damsel in distress or she's the cliche attempted female vampire. So she's not a bad character, but I just find her to be kind of annoying and a big cliche. What the hell? Cold Skin. I'll have to check that out. Wait, that sounds odd. That sounds like a movie that I watched not too long ago. But my biggest problem with this movie is Evil Ed. One, he's annoying as fuck. He's got a really annoying, screechy, high-pitched, obnoxious voice. Oh, you're so cool, Brewster. And when he becomes a vampire, he's even more annoying. Like the scene when he drives away with Jerry and Amy in the backseat, just goes, could you be any more hammy? And also, when he turns into a werewolf, it's lame. He shows up sprouting fangs, threatening Peter, and when Peter runs away, he runs out transformed into a wolf. jumps on Peter and then just gets impaled and morphs back into his human form. How anticlimactic is that? Because actually, with his personality, he could have been like a fun secondary antagonist, but he's done and over with in a piss and a squirt. But my main issue with him is that he is annoying as fuck. Like, holy shit. Other than that, that's all I really have to say about Fright Night. I love this movie. It's a lot of fun. It's a very well-made vampire movie. It pays tribute to its roots very, very well, and it's just a lot of fun. Not scary, not scary at all, actually, but it's a lot of fun. A lot of people like to say Creepshow, the original movie, is one of those horror movies that is it's a fun time being scared. I would actually say Fright Night has when you have a fun time being scared, even though it's really not a scary film. But yeah, Fright Night's a fun movie. I will also be giving Fright Night a 9 out of 10. This is a classic, fun vampire movie. If you're a big fan of vampires, I highly recommend you check this film out. And also, if you're a Tom Holland fan, of course, if you haven't checked this film out, please go right ahead. And I said it before, but I'll say it again. I like this more than the first Child's Play movie. Sue me. Post your comments down below and let me know what you think. Hit the like button and hit the subscribe button and share this video with your friends. And as always, go out in the middle of the night if you see a dude in a long silver trench coat offering you his long fingers and saying you were born for this. Just run, or just pull out a cross, because vampires are so easy to thwart. So yeah, and I will see you guys in the next one.